Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to go into detail about the 5,000 series of Victor records. Now, I have made recordings about this. I've talked about it. I've been doing a lot of research on the history of this amazing grouping of records that are so ridiculously rare. It's remarkable. Now you have to understand, let me go through a little bit of the history here to allow everything to fall into place. Now, with the disc market, and you got to remember, in 1902 going into 1903, the disc market was somewhat of a relatively recent affair. Everybody branches out from the Berliner gramophone. All the various companies that would be started its home base with Emil Berliner and the disc. Now, granted, there were various incarnations of that disc, going back into Europe initially, with the first experiments with celluloid and things like that, and little 5-inch discs, and they were toys, and Berliner himself made a lot of the records and stuff like that. Those were very, very unique, very rare. I'm hoping to perhaps show one of those eventually. I confess I do not possess one. Don't have the resources for that, but I have some friends who have them, and I'm hoping I can borrow one to use in a discussion. But let's jump past that and go to the disc industry. Now, the disc industry, of course, let's do a little show and tell here. This, of course, is the Berliner gramophone disc, okay? Now, the Berliner gramophone disc, very, very popular, was doing a pretty good job of shaking up the cylinder companies, but still, it was the disc. It wasn't quite as at least in the 1890s, as sophisticated as the cylinder. But that would soon change. You had, under the umbrella of the Berliner gramophone, some very, very talented people. You had very good recording artists, you had really good machinists, you had very good inventors, you had very good developers, you had very good negotiators. And these individuals would spread themselves out from the nucleus that was the Berliner Gramophone Company in the United States and create something much larger and much grander. And that's what's going to lead to the recordings I'm going to talk about shortly. But every story has a bit of a preamble, and this, of course, is the preamble to this. Emil Berliner, upon finally becoming rather successful with the Berliner gramophone record and disc, sends his relatives, his brothers, his cousins, everybody, to set up companies in Europe. First in Germany. Then, as time went on, they eventually set up a company in England. Now, the main company that would be called the Gramophone Company, the Gramophone Company of Europe, let's just leave it that way, was mainly based in London. That was the main area. There were stamping facilities in Germany. There were offices in various major cities throughout the world by the time we reached the end of the 19th century. But the main area was going to be the London office, the gramophone. Now, when they first started making records there, and it's interesting that Berliner sent his brother to Germany and whatever, and it took a long time to set things up, okay? In fact, an interesting point of view is that in the beginnings of the gramophone company in Europe, their first manufacturing facilities were within tents, with machines sent over from the United States to stamp out records. Kind of interesting. Now, nothing can get done until they send recording engineers. And that's where Fred Gaisberg comes in very, very importantly, in the beginnings of 1898. That's when the whole disc market of Europe really starts to begin, late 1898. Now, this is a very early gramophone record from Europe. Now, this is from 1898. In fact, it's from, what was it? September the 22nd, 1898. And it's number 1007. It's right at the very, very beginning. Now, there's something very interesting that you will notice that does not exist on this record. First off, it's the gramophone company. Second off, you notice it doesn't have a logo. When you think of the European records, you think of the recording angel. That had not arrived yet. This is pre-angel. Pre-angel gramophone. Okay, it's right at the very beginning. By the end of 1898, they've got their angel. Here, I covered these up so I could make them more viewable. But here, now this is a later gramophone record. And of course, you'll see the angel inscribed on the label there. Now, that's important because the gramophone company in England, or let's just say in Europe, because they were all over the place making recordings, was very, very different from its distant cousin in the United States. Whereas in 1899, so much was being recorded in a classical nature, also popular, in Europe, much more so than it was being done in the United States. And by 1900, things really started changing a lot. You had the manager of the gramophone company, what was his name? William Barry Owens, who was from the United States, working, of course, with Fred Gaisberg, who was from the United States. Lots of individuals there were from the United States. In fact, it's an interesting point to think of, that the gramophone company of Europe had a decidedly American accent. Interesting thing to point out. Now, of course, the Berliner company is attacked in the United States. And it's destroyed through the efforts of Frank Seaman with Zonophone, his incarnation, supported completely by the Columbia Graphophone Company, or the Columbia Phonograph Company. Now, of course, Seaman, Columbia, they start to thrive in 1900 into 1901. And there's a little bit of a shake-up in Europe, but not too much. But William Barry Owen, who's from New England, had a very, very bad and strong fear that the Gramophone Company of Europe wasn't going to survive. He panicked a little bit. He was one of these impulsive people who came up with ideas real quick, sometimes without a great deal of thought. The whole image of Nipper looking into the gramophone, that was his idea, more or less. Not completely, but vast majority of is basically, he said to the artist, Berard, paint in our machine, we'll buy the painting. And then, of course, by 1899, Berliner gets a copyright on that. And it becomes nothing to do with Berliner, but eventually become part of Victor, which Berliner becomes a part of. Now, the thing is that by late 1900, Owen sees what's happening in the United States. He's a little concerned. Also, he thinks it's a bubble. How long will people keep buying these records? And so he creates a whole new company within the company, at least for its name. They invest in the Lampert typewriter, which was a frickin' disaster. But they changed the name of the company to the Gramophone and Typewriter Company, hence its name. They invested a good deal of the capital of the Berliner Company into this piece of crap typewriter. And the name was changed. Now, of course, that leads to the Gramophone and Typewriter Company. The Gramophone and Typewriter Company really focuses a good deal on classical artists. Now, that's not to say that they didn't do everything else. They did. They did every type of music you can think of. But whereas in the United States, by the time we get through Consolidated and we get through into the Victor Talking Machine Company of October of 1901, the effort is not too strong on classical, but popular, coon songs, minstrel records, bands, piccolo solos, lots of those. Well, they recorded well. Cornet solos. You name the genre, it was somewhat represented. However, the classical was not truly very well represented. You did have Emilio di Gorza, who was from Brooklyn, New York, by the way. And he was Ed Franklin, he was Senor this, Senor that. He had every nom de plume you could think of when he made those records. Eventually he went by his own name, but his early career was being Senor Francisco and a few others, which just at the moment I can't think of. But he had like about 4 different names. And he made records for Zonophone, he had made records for Berliner, he made records for Victor, he made records for Columbia. He was all over the place. That was kind of the limit to where classical or operatic recordings were being made in the United States. Now, granted, you had others. You had Bettini on cylinder. We had Edison on cylinder. Bettini was focused completely, to a degree, on operatic classical recordings. His mass marketing was nil. I mean, there were just a handful of copies made of his recordings. Sadly, most don't exist anymore. They were destroyed in a warehouse during World War II. But the thing is that in the United States, it was kind of a wasteland artistically. And it's odd to think about that because right across the way from Philadelphia and Camden, New Jersey, and New York City, where recordings were being made and where the Columbia Phonograph Company was the Metropolitan Opera House, one of the most famous opera houses in the world. Yet no one was recording them yet. And then in 1902, Calvin Child, who was the head of the recording department for the new Victor Talking Machine Company, and Calvin Child had gone the way of many people there. He started with the Columbia Phonograph Company, went to Berliner, eventually became part of Victor. And of course he became the head of the recording department. He was very well versed in music. He had a phenomenal personality. He was one of those people you could walk into a room with him and he'd have the party going. Very, very witty, heavy set, short little guy, but he was extremely good at what he did. And so he had been working with Eldridge Johnson in trying to revamp the Berliner catalog, and then started to do the recordings for Victor, consolidated before. And by the latter part of 1902, it's pretty well thought of with the Victor Company looking at its distant cousin across the water, that they are doing all kinds of classical operatic recording. And what you have to understand is what was the opera singer in the beginning of the 20th century. They had the status of the greatest stars of today. You know, take your Lady Gagas and your Madonnas and, you know, past few years, Michael Jackson and the like. That's what an opera singer was to the general public. They were godlike. And Eldridge Johnson, in sitting with members of his group, decided that what they need to do, I think probably with the good support of Childs, was to go talk and negotiate with the Gramophone and Typewriter Company and see if we can have an exchange with our matrices with theirs. We can send them stampers and they can send us stampers. And after a lot of negotiations, and of course you also had Bedford Royal, who was a very close friend of Eldridge Johnson's. And he was always sent in places to make sure everything ran the way Johnson wanted it to. Very important. He would later leave the Gramophone and Typewriter Company and go to Newark, New Jersey to run the Zonophone Company. And that was Bedford Royal who ran that in later years, because he was always there to support the interest of Eldridge Johnson. And he made, through the efforts of Johnson, Bedford Royal, and Barry Owens, etc., working together, they came up with a deal on a kind of a Lend-Lease program with stampers, with both sides. And really, if you think about it, it was a bigger deal for Victor to get from G&T rather than it was for G&T to get from Victor, at least at that moment. However, things would change drastically as time went on. So, in December of 1902, Calvin Child takes the RMS Oceanic over to England. Now, this is prestige. You know, the Oceanic was known as the Queen of the Oceans. It was probably one of the most famous ships afloat in 1902. It was of the White Star Line, and it was a fabulous vessel. It was of the type of ship that would inspire what was called the Olympic class several years later. It was ornate, it was fast, it was a very safe ship, subdivided, and they always talked about its practical unsinkability. But not to go into that too much, but just to mention the fact that Calvin Child goes to London, goes to England, arriving on the most spectacular ship on the ocean. Just a little bit of puffery there. It's a great thing to arrive on, you know. And so he works out deals, they talk, they go through recordings, and then they decide to, after Child selects, send a whole bunch of stampers to the United States. Now, these recordings that they check out are from 1901 and 1902. They were made in a system of which they could make one stamper. That was it. And when that stamper wore out, that was it. So they had carefully learned a new art that after they stamp records, they discover it's a really popular one. They would stamp wax with the stamper and go through the whole process again so they'd have another stamper, but it's a copy. And inherently, the fidelity is just a little less each time they do that. And so Child listened to the various first generation and second generation recordings, picked out quite a few, and then with a courier sent to the United States the first batch of 50 stampers. Now these were advertised in March of 1903. They are the first operatic recordings commercially available of major artists. Now, the Columbia Company, which had always been a thorn in the side of Victor or Berliner, counters within 2 weeks with the Columbia disc operatic record, the operatic grand opera disc record made by Columbia. Now, Columbia takes the credit for the first recordings made in the United States of major operatic stars. However, it was wildly unsuccessful. And the way it worked with Columbia, Edward Easton was the head of the Columbia Company, when he wouldn't see an immediate return financially, he was impulsive and would cancel what he was doing. The amount of money invested in making those recordings for Columbia, you had Sembrek, you had Adams, you had Direske, you had Scotty, Schumann, Heinck. These are major, major performers from the Metropolitan Opera. And they paid fabulous amounts of money to acquire their services. Mainly because they wanted to take the thunder away from what they were well aware of, which was going to be the Victor Red Seal record. They came out with a splash. They were $2 each. They were expensive. But they just didn't sell. So they were canceled. Now on the other side of the coin was the Victor Company with their red seals. They called them the 5000 series. To call them successful would be an out-and-out lie. They were as wildly unsuccessful as the Columbias. But Eldridge Johnson understood the prestige of the artist. That's very important. We forget that fact at times, because Johnson understood the prestige. Therefore, he made sure, even though it didn't make money, even though they were losing their shirt on various things with classical artists, they realized that the star power was the greatest asset to the Victor Company.